Alrighty, take number 5. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're viewing this video. My name is Joseph Uncle, and today's topic is going to be supporting students with dyslexia, but more particularly focusing on how to support students with dyslexia with reading comprehension. I originally wanted to focus the topic of my literature review to focus on reading comprehension for students with dyslexia in a social studies classroom. That is the area that I wish to teach in, and I figured that would probably be the most applicable to me. I quickly realized, however, that I kind of limited myself because when a lot of this research is done, it's not necessarily being taken in a social studies setting. They just focus on reading comprehension as a whole. Just from my experience in a social studies classroom and through reading this, I can apply this to the social studies classroom. I don't need the research to be like, it was conducted in a social studies classroom. That's the only way it applies. So from my exposure, I can build these connections, and having any support for our struggling learners will see academic gains all over. So I do want to apologize before I move on that I can't make the screen larger. I've been having severe tech issues trying to record this video, so we're just gonna have to deal like this. Also, Zoom and my webcam are for some reason on the fritz, and Wi-Fi is spotty at the moment, so I would normally show you my face, but I cannot do so. So without further ado, let's get into this. So introduction, setting the scene a little bit. What we know about students with dyslexia is that they struggle academically. Now you might be saying, Joe, well, no duh, they have a specific learning disability. However, I bring up this point not to just be to state the obvious, but to realize the trickle effect that can occur because of this. When students with dyslexia struggle academically, actually better yet, let's take it back a step. Students with dyslexia struggle with literacy development, whether that's reading comprehension or anything that has to do in that academic domain. The issues in that field are going to trickle into other aspects. So now they might be struggling in science and math. Literacy, being able to read, is required in all subjects and all really aspects of life. So when students struggle in other classes, that puts them at risk of academic failure. When you're at risk of academic failure, risk dropping out, whatever, that could lead to larger issues later in life for our students. So we have to realize that reading comprehension, no matter what the context, is vital for all students, but for the focus of this literature review, students with disability, so that they can navigate through life effectively. Now, since we are in an education course, what can our educators do? And we need to think, when we want to support these students, we need to understand the nature of this disability, and we need to look at different support systems to help our students with dyslexia and differentiate our instruction for these students, and we can expand that to all students. All learners are different, and it only makes sense that we support them through different means. Now into the meat and potatoes. I reviewed a whole lot more literature than I honestly expected for this project. I was expecting a quick get 6 resources and bada bing bada boom being done. However, I realized it was not going to be that easy. And I read a lot of more research, and it gave me, though, a lot more insight to stuff. And a common theme I realized across this is there's a debate in the field across time. From my earliest study I had was 1989, but I did not include it for this presentation or in my lit review, all the way up to present, where there's this debate between, is dyslexia a language-based disorder, or is it more or less a information processing disorder? Information processing is the word that I am using. I've seen people say, like, oh yeah, they have struggles. They have struggles processing information, but like, I just playing on the words that I saw, put it into this context. And my rationale for coming through this conclusion is going to be the first 2 studies that we are about to look at. So when I go through these, just to save time, I'm going to try to focus more along what the procedure was, or what the initial goal of the research was, what they wanted to show, critical elements of their experiments, and the results of this, and then we can expand this to educators and what we can do to support them. So in our first study here, technology became a huge asset. So in this study, the researchers said, well, we have PET scans. Why don't we put people with dyslexia and not dyslexia into a PET scan as they perform various tasks that require elements of phonological awareness or any other reading comprehension, anything that has to do with literacy development, basically. So as our participants are in these PET scan machines and images of the brain are being taken, participants are asked to perform a series of activation tasks. And activation task is simply just something to get brain activity going. And these were divided into similarity and short-term memory tasks. In the similarity tasks, they break it down into rhyme judgment and shape similarity. So, can our people with dyslexia identify when there's similarities with words, so thus why rhyming, and can they see similarities between shapes? And for this experiment, they used Korean letters, something that was unknown to our 10 males who were probably white, cis, and straight. So it makes sense that they would use Korean letters. The other hand, short-term memory is kind of the same thing, but also kind of different, where the phonological short-term memory task said, let's show them a series of consonants that are dissimilar, and can they remember the sequence in which they occur? After they are shown one aspect, there will be like a 2-second pause, and then a probing consonant may be introduced, and that will just be a replacement, inserting an extra letter, and they want to see, hey, can this be recognized? And visual short-term task is basically the same thing, except they used Korean letters. Now, sorry, let me just have my handy-dandy notes right here. Now, when it came to what the brain images reviewed or showed in the PET scan, was that for the rhyming task in particular, people with dyslexia really did not activate this area of the brain known as the insula. And from my understanding from the researchers, the insula kind of acts as a bridge, and that's the researchers' words, not mine, between the hemispheres of the brain. They noticed that this section of the brain was not really relaying information. And it also seems that they are citing the insula as the reason why for when they did the phonological short-term task. Again, these are aspects that have to do with the participants' ability in literacy development tasks. In the phonological short-term memory task, they noticed that there was just significantly overall a lot less brain activity. And they cited that, well, because the insula is not relaying information from the two hemispheres back and forth to each other, that there is some sort of disconnect in the brain with our students with dyslexia. And they cite that this is potentially the reason why our people struggle with literacy skills, because the two brains are not working in concert with each other. And that's that term that they use. They're activated, but on smaller scales, and there's not this information exchange, really. As teachers, what this study instantly tells us is that each person's brain is wired differently. And we cannot assume a typical brain structure, not just for our students with dyslexia, but all our learners. Educators need to work with our learners in their current neurological structure, because that's something that our educators are not going to be able to change. Now, just to extend this study a little bit more, I have another study here by Nation and Stolen, and they said, let's keep focusing on this information delay, disconnection, whatever term you want to use here. But they added a slight little difference to it, where they said, all the research that has been done so far with students with dyslexia and reading comprehension has been focusing on phonological processing issues, but not so much semantic. And their basically hypothesis is, you know what? Students with dyslexia, they have phonological awareness. They can decode, they know the letter sounds, they can put things together. But if dyslexia is more or less an information disconnection, semantic processing is the issue here. And semantic processing, from my understanding, is basically just the ability to put words to their corresponding meaning to it. In other words that I've been using is automatic connections, basically. When we think of the word dog, we're going to think of this small little creature instantly with a dopey little tongue hanging out. But with our students with dyslexia, they might not be able to put the word with the meaning instantly. There's a lack of automatic connections being made. So this study was probably actually the most in-depth one I reviewed and probably the most complicated one. It was a bit dense. But they had 3 different experiments that went on here. Experiment 1 and 2 were very similar, in which they said, well, let's confirm the fact that students with dyslexia do not struggle with phonological processing, but semantic processing issue. So in experiment 1, they had a synonym and rhyme task. In the synonym task, it was just students are shown a word and potential synonyms and antonyms. Can they identify what words have similar meanings? Rhyme task, same situation except with rhyming. Series of words. Can they show which words rhyme with each other based off of structure? Experiment 2, actually before I go to experiment 2, the synonym task in this represented the semantic processing because that had to do with attaching meaning to our words, whereas rhyme was more or less the phonological aspect. Experiment 2 basically kind of confirms experiment 1. The semantic fluency, so thus our semantic processing is being reviewed here, was basically the participants were given a category. And this category, one of them was animals. And within 60 seconds, students just needed to list off as many animals as possible. And rhyme fluency was kind of similar with the time constraints, but it was, here's a word, how many more words can you think of that rhyme with it? In both of these experiments, the result was the same, that students with dyslexia performed worse on anything that had to do with semantic processing. So that was our synonym task and our semantic fluency task. And for the most part, everyone was equal when it came to the phonological processing tasks. For experiment 3, since they realized that, okay, that their hypothesis is going in the direction that they hoped, they wanted to test the extent of the semantic processing. And what they did was, they said, okay, students students are going to be put into this process where they're going to be exposed to different words that have either a high frequency or a low frequency. So high frequency meaning they're common in their speech, low frequency, not so much, and regular and exception words. So regular being like you can decode them through phonological processing, exception words being like, oh, well, you can't really decode those too much because something makes them different. The English language is complex. From this aspect of the study, they said, yes, students with dyslexia, they make more errors and were slower with processing words that were low frequency, so words they weren't exposed to, and these exception words, stuff that they could not easily decode. All this comes back to their final conclusion is to support the idea that even when the phonological ability is the same in participants, the semantic processing is what matters. And the semantic processing and other automatic processing issues is what leads to poor reading comprehension for our students with dyslexia. So, as an educator, taking this research now into account, educators are going to realize that, okay, if much of the research has been done around phonological processing, and any supports given have been to increase phonological awareness, phonological processing, students might be receiving supports that aren't effective. As this shows, some students, if they have a firm understanding of phonological processing, they might need more help with the semantic and other automatic processing abilities. They might need help with attaching the meaning to our words. And that can also include information encoding, retrieving, anything else that has to do with how our memory system works. Educators need to really individualize to the students' needs. Since these two studies that we have here really focus on the neurological aspect of dyslexia, it's very easy to connect these two. And they basically say the same things in different ways and add some new information. Each brain is wired differently, whether they have dyslexia or not. In the Nation Stolen study, it was added to the picture that a lot of times students with dyslexia can decode the words, and the issues with comprehension has to do with the lack of semantic and other automatic processing, being able to connect the word with its meaning instantly. And this will also, at least to me as someone that was going through this research, implies a fluency issue, which I did explore and will get to at a later point in this presentation. Bringing in our first study here, I think it's pronounced Paulesu. Their study was just called, let's make sure I don't mess this up, their study was simply just called, is developmental dyslexia a disconnection syndrome? So, from their research, it throws into this equation, if a disconnect is present, again, going back to the insula, Nation and Stolen's conclusion does make sense. As these learners, they're working harder in the information processing and retrieval. So going back to how I started this with the initial debate around is dyslexia a language processing disorder or an information process disorder, from the literature I reviewed for this assignment, it would seem that it falls more in line with the information processing disorder. And this is a critical component because knowing that information processing could be the true issue with dyslexia will influence the supports that we give our students with dyslexia. So that is now going to go into how can we support these learners? What can educators do? And what has research shown thus far? So the first study has to do with Exley. And Exley explores this topic of learning styles. Exley noted at the start of it is like, you know what, there's this philosophy of every person has their own unique learning style, preferred learning techniques. And this is a philosophy that went back to the ancient Greeks. But she noted that there really was not a whole lot of research to actually back this claim. And there was even less research to support this claim for students with dyslexia. So for her study, she said, all right, we're going to put our subjects through a 12-week program, 3 weeks dedicated to assessment, reassessment, and interviews to collect data and analyze trends, and 9 weeks to teach these students in accordance to their preferred learning styles. After the initial data was gathered, the results confirmed that learning styles is something that teachers need to pay attention to in their study. The results showed that when educators appeal to the learners, in this case students with dyslexia's preferred learning styles, they're going to see greater gains in post-assessments, and the students themselves are just going to report being able to understand the material more than they did before. They've even went as far to say that they felt empowered and responsible for their learning because for once education made sense for them. Now, just tying in some of the neurological stuff that we discussed with the previous two studies, this makes sense. Learning styles, each person's brain is wired differently. Since each brain is wired differently, it makes sense why learning styles exist. Our brain is hardwired and likes certain neurological pathways over others. And the brain is going to try to take those paths to help with the encoding and eventually later retrieval of information. So knowing this as a teacher, reading comprehension can be increased for students with dyslexia if when we give instruction, we go to their preferred learning styles. And that again goes back to using the neurological pathways that are already laid out within the students' brains. Now, next, instead of taking a larger study, we're going to focus on a case study. When it comes to supporting students with dyslexia, or honestly, any student with a disability, Long and colleagues say teachers need to be compassionate and they have to be empathetic towards their students with disabilities. They followed a case study of Matthew, and he was a struggling learner. He had dyslexia, and he was struggling academically. Behavior issues started to become a concern. And when the school finally decided to act on it and give him proper supports, give the educators proper professional development on it, and implement supports across all his subjects, Matthew started to improve. And from his initial interviews and also interviews afterwards, he really focused on this idea of, now my teachers care about me, and they want to support me, and they want to see me successful. So Long and colleagues said, well, let's see if this is true for more people. Now, this study is still rather small. I personally believe this is the start of a larger research study that would occur. They interviewed more students with dyslexia to see what points line up with what Matthew was saying. And from it, some critical points that the students from these interviews revealed was that the students themselves believed dyslexia equated to being stupid. And that really hurt their self-concept and their self-esteem and their willingness to want to learn and take academic risks within a classroom. They felt they were too far gone, so why learn if there was nothing they could do about it? They also learned from these interviews that the students with dyslexia, they struggle a whole lot with traditional styles of education, whether that's dictation, meaning taking notes, writing notes, reading, whatever, or just straight up lecture, they struggled with, and they weren't being able to get the most from that form of instruction. And lastly, going back to Matthew's key point idea, is that teachers did not have empathy for them. They noted that the teachers know they had a disability, and yet at the same time they did not feel they had the support or the care from their educators. Now, all this kind of reveals like a nodal to us as students of the GSE, and for anyone that studies Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that students can really not be expected to develop reading comprehension skills or any other form of literacy development if the environment is not safe, if the environment is not supportive and individualized for those learners' unique needs. As a teacher, this tells us that differentiation is key. It is not something to be, implemented sparingly or when need be. It needs to be ingrained. Differentiation has to be at the core of our instructions. When you differentiate, that's going to communicate with our students with dyslexia, like, we care for you and we value your education so much that we are going to revolve our instruction around what works best for you. And when the students feel loved and cared for, they're going to be able to put more forward. On to the next study reviewed. We have an Italian study here. And as hinted earlier by our Nation in Stolen study, when there's a lack of automatic processing, that might also imply that fluency development issues are a concern. So this study takes a look at fluency and how that would potentially influence reading comprehension for students with disability. So in this study, they took a group of students and they put all of them through a control trial. In this trial, all the learners were pre-tested, given training in linguistic methods. They didn't really explain so much what linguistic methods meant, but I'm going to assume that it was more or less along the lines of phonological processing, the decoding, something that our previous study, one of our previous studies, noted as a lot of students with dyslexia can do already. And then given a post-test. This could put everyone on the same level, So when the next stage of the trial, which they called A-B trial, um, they can test differences. And it's called A-B because one group received a treatment and one group did not receive a treatment. So the no treatment group was that the learners that were getting the linguistic methods, they just continued to get it. Whereas the treatment group would be introduced to a new style of learning. And this new style was called the subsyllabic method. I believe that's how it's pronounced. And what this method focuses on is making larger chunks of the words that are being viewed. And the larger chunks in this situation are the syllables of the words. This was actually further broken down into a self-paced aspect versus an automatic process. Self-paced should be self-explanatory, and automatic is basically that the students and their families did not really have had control over the pace at which they went. Students were basically forced to meet timelines, deadlines, hit checkpoints, limited time to work on tasks. And this is critical when analyzing our results. Out of these three methods, the automatic subsyllabic method proved to be superior. And this was because in the self-paced version of it, a lot of the students were still focusing on ineffective techniques for reading comprehension and thus fluency. They were going back to the decoding of the word and then connecting meaning. With the automatic, they did not have enough time to keep decoding every single word. So it forced them to become more automatic in their processing, looking at larger chunks and looking at larger chunks of the word to derive meaning, basically. Now, this right here is a little surprising compared to the literature we've reviewed thus far. As a matter of fact, I would argue this goes directly against Exley's learning style study, basically. What if the student wants to learn at a slower pace? This goes against it because it's like, hey, no, basically. Now, the huge implication from this is, even with our long study, we want to create a safe and supportive environment, and we want to appeal for learning styles. Yet our education needs to remain rigorous, and we need to sometimes push past the students' comfort zones in order to see results in some sort of academic gain. In this instance, that gain is going to be seen in fluency. When fluency overall is improved, we're going to see improvements in reading comprehension. And that's because, as we read from our textbook, if we're spending so much time on decoding the words and our fluency is poor, we don't have enough cognitive space available left over to comprehend what we just read. Once fluency is improved, we will then see reading comprehension improvements. Moving right along, and I believe this is our last study for this, is, well, what's the role of technology in all this? We started off this video recording talking about how the PET scan really revolutionized our understanding of dyslexia. Technology can be used to support our learners, especially our learners with dyslexia. So in this study, the researchers said, okay, previous studies have showed that a multi-sensory instruction, so instruction that revolves around multiple human senses, so touch, smell, taste, hearing, vision, all that good stuff. That has already been confirmed by other research, but they really wanted to focus on, can technology elicit this same positive results? And then once again, using special scans, they said, well, let's look at brain activity with this whole thing. So this is once again a case study, and they had this 14-year-old boy work with this, I believe it's an app, I'll just say educational software, just to be safe, called Auto-Train Brain. And they put him into an EEG scan and measured 14 different regions in the brain associated with literacy development, reading comprehension, etc. And they said, let's take initial scans of his first exposure to Auto-Train Brain. Once the initial scans were taken, the boy was instructed to continue to work with the educational software every single day for at least 10 minutes for the next 9 weeks. After the boy completed this, they put him back into the EEG scan, and kind of like we were expecting, um, the multisensory and the multimedia elements of it, which again, multimedia elements support our multisensory instruction, because if you have a video in there, that's going to appeal to our hearing and our sight. Where was I going with this? There was an overall increase in brainwave activity. The multisensory instruction was was not only just reaffirmed, but it showed that technology, especially multimedia technology, can elicit the same results as traditional in-person multisensory instruction. Also during that time, due to his exposure with this educational technology, the student showed academic gains within his own learning experience. As teachers, this study reinforces that when we give instruction, we have to appeal to multiple senses. Each learner's brain is wired differently. That was established with our first two studies that we investigated. And the more senses that we can bring in to instruction will help strengthen the pathways within brains, or just help with that information encoding and retrieval because it's put into sensory memory. And we can retrieve it by having exposure to a certain senses. Basically what I'm trying to say with that, it's kind of like when we go to maybe a grandparent's house and we smell cookies. We're going to instantly maybe remember the taste or the memory that we had with grandma. Basically that. This study also tells us as educators that, hey, multimedia elements is not just good for all learners, but especially good for our students with dyslexia. We want our education to be rigorous, and we want them to be more understandable to as many students as possible. Multimedia can elicit multiple senses being involved in instruction, thus making the encoding and later information retrieval easier for our students. And once again, this all makes sense because of our brain's wiring and how every brain is wired differently. So through all of this, reading comprehension is part of this information retrieval and encoding process. And when, what am I trying to say here? To support students in reading comprehension, we can include these multimedia and multisensory instructions to elicit more comprehension. Across all the literature that is reviewed above, and I'm going to actually post this PowerPoint along with this video, there's three main takeaways that educators need to pull from this. One, thing that I've been saying this entire presentation, all learners' brains are wired differently, especially our students with dyslexia. Educators need to use this brain structure difference to their advantage, cannot just rely on a one-size-fits-all model. Educators need to appeal to the preferred learning styles, incorporate multisensory and multimedia elements into instruction if we want to see gains in reading comprehension. On the same side, since every learner learns differently, this is a direct call to arms that teachers need to differentiate their instruction. Don't just differentiate it when there's an IEP or a 504 involved. All learners, regardless of classification or not, need differentiated instruction. Next, especially with our students with dyslexia, fluency is a huge element of reading comprehension. If fluency lacks, if there is a lack of semantic and other automatic processing abilities, too much cognitive space is filled up in their brains, and there's little room for reading comprehension. Fluency needs to be developed in order for reading comprehension to eventually develop. And lastly, we need to make a safe, supportive, and inclusive environment for our students with disability. If our environment lacks empathy, how can we expect our students to learn anything? How can we expect them to be able to perform reading comprehension skills if they do not feel safe? If the lower aspects of Maslow's hierarchy of needs are not fulfilled, we cannot expect them to get there. We need to create an environment that supports them and encourages them to meet their goals and make strong academic gains. Just to put a final remark on this whole thing, that one thing this literature review really hammered home for me is that educators ourselves, even though we might be teaching the youth of our nation, educators themselves are also learners for life. We cannot just say we have a degree and I know everything. The field changes so much. Education, the field of education and research that influences it. We need to be up to date with whatever research comes our way to make sure that our students are getting the most appropriate education. Our methods make sense from a research-based perspective. And to make sure that we always remain reflective in our instruction. And with that, I will just show off my reference slides here. It's a little small, but you can pause it and zoom in, I'm sure. These are the references used. There's a lot of other ones that I've also read during this time, but I did not go into with this. I've learned actually a whole lot from this, and the importance of this literature review really, or the experience of doing this will honestly stick with me. I'd be lying if I say I didn't enjoy this. I enjoyed this a whole lot, probably more than I'd like to admit, and I'm happy that I got this opportunity. If anything did not make sense, I understand this is a rather lengthy video. I'll read the threaded discussions, replies. Anyone can also contact me. And thank you for listening or watching. And I hope you took something away from this, just like I took a whole lot away from this. And with that, farewell.